UV on human health. One is a cell study. And so what this means, you get a group of human cells, skin cells or otherwise, in a lab. You take a UV light, you shine it on them. You observe what happens. What happens is bad. That's true. They get damaged by it. Why is that? So why don't I just believe that? Why don't I just believe, well, the cells get damaged by UV light, end of the story? Many reasons. One, it's already an unnatural environment. You are not a clump of cells in a petri dish. Two, the sun is not just UV light, right? The sun is a whole spectrum of light, two of which, or a slice of which, red and infrared, is actually restorative against the very kinds of damage, which UV has a ton of health benefits, right? But there's also this kind of damage component. But other parts of the sun spectrum actually restore. And so when they do these cell studies, they're modeling a scenario that doesn't exist in nature. The sun is not isolated UV light. And so showing that isolated UV light is bad does not prove it. In the same way that rice has arsenic in it. Like if I prove that arsenic's bad for you.
Or fruit has sugar in it, but it's not, you're not eating just the sugar, you're eating the whole apple.
Exactly, right? So those studies are pretty flawed, and you can also get into it's actually done under blue light, artificial lights in a lab. The blue light is also kind of phototoxic. It's amplifying it. Anyways, I think the average person gets that it's not super generalizable. All you really have proved is that to a group of cells, UV on its own is a toxin. Okay, fine. There's really not too much you can do with that. And then the other type of study, which is better, but still has its problems, is population data. And so they'll look at surfers in Australia, or higher UV countries or lower UV countries, or populations that work outside versus work inside, or the military. And they'll see what are the skin cancer rates. So these are more valid. There still are problems. I've already highlighted one of them. And one of those problems is that you're not controlling for circadian rhythm. But let's dig deeper into that. There's a concept in the literature called intermittent sun exposure. And basically this refers to somebody, let's say, who works inside in an office in Manhattan Monday through Friday, and then on the weekend they get a ton of sun. That person would be considered having intermittent sun exposure. Whereas then you have someone who has consistent sun exposure, let's call it someone that works outside, all week, they're just outside every day. Intermittent sun exposure is a much higher risk than consistent sun exposure. So these population studies don't control for that. We also know for a fact that, yes, sunburns raise your skin cancer risk. Fine. Don't get a sunburn. It's literally a sign that your body has received more UV light than it can handle. Now, that's also kind of an interesting thing. I am Fitzpatrick type 2 skin. If you don't know what that means, it means I have blue eyes, I have blonde hair, I have light skin, right? My ancestors are from Europe, and Europe is a lower UV environment. I live in South Florida. South Florida is a much higher UV environment than my genetic ancestors grew up in. However, I'm outside all day and I don't burn. Why is that? It's because I adapted gradually over a couple years by exposing my body to that environment. And now I haven't gotten a sunburn in years, and I'm outside constantly. Am I laying on my back just baking there? No, I'd probably burn if I did that. But that's also kind of unnatural. I'm walking around, I'm doing things, and it's fine. So when you get consistent sun exposure, your body builds up a tolerance for it. It's used to it. It's something it manages, right? So these studies don't control for that. They don't control for circadian rhythm. And circadian rhythm directly influences how much damage you take, because your DNA, your skin cells and other cells, they have kind of a repair cycle, right? Where during the night, they repair DNA damage, and during the day, they literally protect the DNA. They physically conceal it from light. But if your body thinks it's nighttime during the day, your DNA is exposed and it's being hit by UV radiation. So that makes
a way that your body might think it's nighttime would be if you are, for example, wearing sunglasses.
Correct. You have sunglasses on the beach. You are inside. You were inside all morning, then you put on sunglasses, you went outside, you went to the beach. Your body has never gotten the right signals to be like, it's daytime. So that literally can increase the amount of damage you're taking, right? So these studies don't control for any of that. I think the audience starts to get the picture, right? So these are the flaws in the research, and I want to set that out because I'm going to just describe what it shows, but let's also be very clear, there are problems with the data. So take everything I say with a grain of salt. Now, what the data shows, even if we just take it at face value, and I don't kind of try to argue any of it, is that there's a relatively verifiable connection that more sunlight is going to increase, I believe it's squamous cell, which is, there's squamous cell, there's basal cell, and there's melanoma. Melanoma is like the really bad one. Squamous and basal cell are the things that, like, you go to the dermatologist and they're like, oh, yeah, we should probably freeze that off.
Right.
And generally you're done. Now, sometimes it can be more complicated. I've had people reach out to me after I said this, like, well, I had this horrible squamous cell. Like, yes, it can happen. But when we're talking about like epidemiology, we have to talk about populations. And generally, this is pretty minor. So
of the 3 types of skin cancer, those first 2 are generally speaking not a big deal.
They're not.
Those are the ones most linked to sun exposure, and then the melanoma is the one that's the
bigger
riskier one. Okay.
But so squamous cell, there's a pretty verifiable, and I may have basal cell and squamous cell flipped here, but basically, I think squamous cell, it's pretty clear sun increases it. Basal cell, it's like maybe, maybe not. There's contradictory evidence. Those 2 might be flipped, but they're both the more minor ones. And then melanoma, which is the really bad one, here's what's interesting. There's a lot of studies that show sunlight lowers it. Melanoma mostly appears on the parts of the body that don't see the sun. It goes up in indoor workers. It's skyrocketing in Northeast Asian countries that are the most sun-phobic cultures. They're a dermatologist's wet dream. Like, no one avoids the sun like Northeast Asian cultures, right? It's a status thing. Light skin is better, and blah blah blah. Melanoma rates are skyrocketing. So there's a lot of contradictory evidence that melanoma is actually caused by sunlight, and that's the bad one. So it's kind of like, probably your risk of the minor ones goes up a bit, your risk of the bad one goes down, maybe quite substantially, and then the highest sunlight groups are much more likely to survive skin cancer, where the lowest sunlight groups are much more likely to die from skin cancer. And so this is the state of the research, not including any of the flaws that I pointed out. So I think if you accounted for those flaws, the data would even be more favorable towards sun's good rather than sun's bad.